Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar series at the Center for Research on College to Workforce Transitions at UW-Madison. My name is Matthew Hora, and I'm the director of CCWT. And we're super excited today to be joined by Alex Frenette, who is in Vanderbilt University right now in warm Tennessee. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
And just before we launch into the research that Alex has been doing on internships, just wanted to briefly introduce this series. A couple of years ago, we started hosting an annual research seminar in Madison about internship research because we felt that there weren't any single places for internship researchers to gather and talk about what they're doing because it tends to be splintered across multiple disciplines, sociology, anthropology, education, and so on. So we did 2 years of the symposium. Alex was one of the speakers at the last one. I've been watching his work for several years now, and it was great to have him come to Madison and share his work. But then, of course, the pandemic happened, and so we decided to go webinar, and it's been really great. We've been able to talk with researchers from China and Hong Kong and Germany, and we've been having people watch the videos that are now posted on our CCWT website after the fact. And so it's been a really nice way to network with researchers and people interested in internships around the world. And so as we have our conversation, and this is an informal chat, this is not a formal webinar where we're just gonna kind of talk at you. Alex and I will be having an informal chit chat after he talks about some of his data. And then if anybody has any questions, please put them in the chat. It's also nice to hear where people are from. And so if in the chat, you can put your name and maybe where you're watching from. It's always good to know where people are. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce Alex. Alex Frenette is an assistant professor of sociology and the associate director of the Curb Center for Art, Enterprise, and Public Policy at Vanderbilt University. His research draws on intersecting interests in arts and culture, work and occupations, and social inequality. And today, Alex will be talking a little bit about some of the data that he analyzed for the SNAP report. And we can start off with that. And then we'll talk about lots of things, but especially on internships in the arts and humanities, especially the arts. And some of the things that he's been seeing in the data, and also we've been seeing in our own research, which are a bit troubling in my view, with respect to who's taking internships, what are some of the barriers that they're experiencing when they look for them, and yeah, and then we'll go from there. And then we have Carrie from Vermont via Stony Brook, which is an interesting geography, but welcome, Carrie Chandra. And yeah, so Alex, do you want to go ahead and take it away?
Yes, absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's great to be here, and it's great to speak with a community of scholars and practitioners who are interested in internship-related issues. I'm happy Carrie said hello because we are a small, but I think very strong group within sociology who are interested in these issues, but I know that this cuts across many disciplinary lines. So I will say a few things about the report, but you said report singular. There are 2 reports, soon to be 2 reports for SNAP. So there's the 2015 report called the Internship Divide that I wrote when I was a postdoc. And that's when I got access to SNAP data, which I'll explain in a moment. And more recently, I just co-authored a report with Dr. Jillian Gualtieri, who's a postdoc, brilliant sociologist at the Curb Center at Vanderbilt, as well as also brilliant Megan Robinson, who's a recent graduate from our PhD program in sociology. And both reports deal with the emergence and importance of internships among arts and design graduates. So SNAP stands for the Strategic National Arts Alumni Project. It's a huge survey of alumni who have graduated with degrees in arts, very broadly speaking. So arts including performing arts, as well as things such as architecture and design, arts management, arts education. So there's a broad understanding of what we mean by the arts, which is interesting because there's a lot of variation within this group. And we could talk more about why am I interested in the arts. This project actually started when I was a graduate student doing a study of internships in the music industry using qualitative methods. So the first SNAP report that came out in 2015, I think made a very strong case that internships have become increasingly common in the arts, amongst arts graduates, certainly. And what I was troubled by in terms of seeing these numbers was that not only have we seen an increase in the prevalence of paid internships, but there was an even faster growth of unpaid internships, especially since the Great Recession. So now most people, something like 2/3 of arts graduates, indicate that they have done some kind of internship. But there's among the very recent graduates from the last decade, they're more likely, slightly more likely to have done a paid internship, an unpaid internship than a paid internship. So I'll just continue with some of the findings from 2015, if that's okay, Matt. Not to break our casual flow here, but I did provide a few I have prepared a few slides I'm ready to present very quickly. I just want to share that SNAP has a few questions on internships it's what I would call the core survey. That I should note is a survey that is administered by SNAP, but what they do is they invite universities, colleges across North America, mostly the US, but some in Canada, to submit their alumni list, which SNAP, that's housed at Indiana University, then contacts and sends a series of emails. So it's a cross-sectional survey. People who graduated a few weeks ago or people who graduated 30 or 40 years ago receive the same survey, which is interesting because it allows us through this method to get a better understanding of what percentage of people did internships when. So people are asked, did you do an internship while you were enrolled at this particular institution? And are you now or have you ever been a paid intern, yes or no, and an unpaid intern, yes or no? And so here, I'll just quickly go through some of the findings that I actually described at the most recent symposium that you co-organized, Matt, which is to find that, as I mentioned, there's an increasing likelihood that people will do at least one internship as part of their undergraduate education. I'm basing this on only undergraduates, so people with a bachelor's degree in the arts, but the patterns are very similar among grad students. So essentially you could see that among those who graduate maybe in the late 80s or earlier, it was maybe 1 in 5 who'd done an internship, and this has really skyrocketed over the years. And if you look at who's done a paid versus unpaid, the gray blue indicates shows what I described earlier, which is that unpaid internships have grown after increasing at an equal rate compared to paid. The unpaid internships have grown more substantially more recently. And as I point out in the 2015 report, that there are patterns in terms of inequality, in terms of who does internships and what kind of internships. Certainly there are some patterns by race, ethnicity, but I feel like because the SNAP survey was administered to only arts and design graduates, and arts and design graduates tend to be white, disproportionately white, something like 85%. Because of that, it's really challenging to make very authoritative claims about the role of race and ethnicity within these types of markets, labor markets and educational markets. But there are some clear trends in terms of gender and in terms of socioeconomic status, which I take as a proxy for SES would be whether or not at least one of your parents has a bachelor's degree. And if neither one of your parents have a bachelor's degree, then you're a first generation college graduate, and therefore that would be a lower socioeconomic status on average. I know that not every discipline measures SES in the same way. So essentially what I found was that women were about as likely as men to do paid internships, but they were disproportionately more likely to do unpaid internships. And first gen college graduates are less likely to do any internship whatsoever. And there's some variation by major. And I guess the key finding of the report was that paid internships are linked to many very positive outcomes in terms of one's career after graduation, but unpaid internships do not seem to be linked to any considerable advantage in the labor market compared to those who had never been interns. So this is a graph that basically shows that those who have done some kind of internship, that's the top line, are very likely to find a job within 1 year after graduation. And you can see more likely than those, the line on the bottom, who were never interns, And the pattern is about the same for those who've done a paid internship, that's the top line, versus no internship on the bottom. But when you compare those who've never been interns to those who did an unpaid internship, the pattern is essentially the same. And I found similar things that essentially people who did paid internships seem to be much more satisfied with their job. So that in terms of job satisfaction, current job satisfaction, they're also more satisfied with their income, et cetera, et cetera. So I was very interested in these differences between paid and unpaid experiences, but I was not quite satisfied with what the data could give us. So as part of my role working with SNAP, I was the primary designer of a module, so a series of 17 questions that were administered to 14 institutions. So about 10,000 alumni received these questions as part of their SNAP participation, because I wanted to know more about the nuts and bolts of who does internships in the arts, more about what are some of the predictors or the mechanisms that can help us explain some uneven patterns by gender and socioeconomic status. And I really wanted to get a better sense of some kind of historical patterns. So I'm going to stop for a moment there, Matt, because my understanding is that this is not a formal talk. So I just want to make sure that I don't plow through all my content. But if you want, I can show a few slides about the new report that is now, I'd say, just a few weeks away from being released.
Ooh, so we get a sneak peek. That's awesome.
You do, yes.
Yeah, no, I'll jump in briefly, Alex, but then I want you to continue. This is a goldmine of data. And if any of the people on the webinar right now have any questions for Alex, please throw something in the chat. I just have one question, Alex, if you can go back to the gender slide. And I suspect you're going to talk a little bit more about this, but I wanted to follow up on the disproportionate number of women taking unpaid internships. We've been digging into our own data, and we're finding that I believe it's over 70% of the students taking our survey, which right now is about 14 institutions, so it's a small data set, but over 70% of the students taking unpaid internships are female. Now, for our own survey, that's in part because the students responding to our survey are disproportionately female. And I think research on surveys have found that women do respond to surveys more often than men. So I guess I have a couple of questions. One is just the distribution of the sample for SNAP in general by gender, but also what's going on. I mean, you've broken this out obviously by, discipline. This is the arts. Ours is multidisciplinary. But there's something definitely going on with gender and unpaid internships that needs to be dug into with greater depth and attention.
Right. Well, good question. Thank you. The distribution of the sample is very gendered. Certainly, I think it's something like 55% to 45 women compared to men for the SNAP sample. It might be slightly more than that, depending on which year, because I'm in the process with another collaborator, Nathan Martin at Arizona State University, to combine essentially two data sets as part of SNAP. There was a survey fielded in 2011, 12, and 13, and there's a different version. That's what I based the 2015 report on. And there was another data set from 2015, 2016, and 2017, the three different years that it was fielded by SNAP. And that survey is slightly different, though I think the core survey, we can make comparisons in terms of these who did internships numbers. But that's the more recent survey is the basis, along with the module that I designed, is the basis of this new report, Growing Divides. It's called Growing Divides, Historical and Emerging Inequalities in Arts Internships. So to answer your question about gender, yes, it is certainly a more female sample and more female population overall, right? More, and that's part of what I was going to say, which is we're controlling for gender in many of these analyses. This is of course just the raw percentage, but it's not 50% of the sample this is per gender category. So 52% of women say that they've been unpaid interns. If we did the approach that you're describing in terms of what percentage of unpaid interns are women, it would probably be much higher than that, right? So And I'd also like to mention that, Matt, it's interesting that you mentioned that you're comparing different fields, because I think that the prevalence of women in unpaid roles in internships, I think reflects larger societal patterns in terms of how work is compensated and whose work is valued. And unfortunately, though things have improved for women in society in the workforce over a few decades, there are still some very noticeable disparities in terms of pay, and in terms of the status of occupations of that are primarily women dominated. So so this is a larger conversation, but I think that even within the case of the arts, architecture, which is maybe more male dominated versus other arts fields, tend to be paid more, and also the internships tend to be paid. So I think that in your research, I'd be really curious to see if you find patterns where certain fields that are female dominated tend to have unpaid internships, and fields that are male dominated tend to have well-paid internships.
Yeah, this is fascinating. In the next slide that you showed about major, I was struck by architecture, how so many of the internships there are paid. And so I mentioned earlier, Alex, I'm talking to you from outside of Cal Poly San Luis Obispo out here in California, where they have a huge architecture program, but part of the institutional ethos is learning by doing. And so I believe internships are required at Cal Poly. And so in architecture, like in business and some other fields, internships have been around for a long time, and there's a strong tradition of them. So I wasn't surprised to see that, but I was struck by how, look at that. The difference across sub areas in the arts is fascinating. So I just want to make one more observation, then I'd love to hear about the results from the new module. One of the other things we found in our analyses is for paid internships, there's a wage gap between men and women. I can't remember the exact dollar amount, but it was not small. And so that's, of course, indicative of another broader societal problem and issue, and we're seeing it within the internship economy. So with that, I'd love to hear about the results from your modules.
That's a fascinating insight. Yeah, I look forward to reading more about that. So the module that was fielded, I mentioned had 17 questions, and I will only provide a kind of the equivalent of the executive summary here. But if you have any follow-up questions, I encourage you, Matt, as well as anybody following along, to please kind of jump in and interrupt if need be, or ask more questions later. One thing I was wondering about, I'm going to focus more on the historical patterns, and then we're going to continue with sort of the inequalities that were documented in this, thanks to this module. But essentially, although the 2015 report, I think, had some pretty robust findings in terms of the rise of the intern economy, and especially of unpaid internships, and then some gendered and class-related inequalities within this type of market, I still had a lot of questions about who does internships, and how they find those internships, how are they supported, and what happens in terms of specific predictors of career outcomes for these internships. And one thing that came up a lot, and I don't think I'll have much of a chance to talk about this, but there was one open-ended question at the very end of the survey. So let me start with that. Just by mentioning that there was one open-ended question where people were asked if, what can your institution do, higher ed institution do, to improve internships for their students? My colleague postdoc Jillian Gualtieri did a fantastic job of developing a coding scheme. Essentially what she's found was that the most prevalent thing that people would say, alumni would say they wish their institutions could do, was help them find quality internships. And not just find an internship, but find high quality internships. And that seems to be a pattern that that is reflected in this figure right here. People were asked how they found what we call some people did multiple internships, so they were asked to describe how they found their most significant internship. They answered a few questions about their quote unquote most significant internship. And it seems like for a few decades, people mostly found their internships through school resources, and that includes faculty connections, career development offices, and alumni networks. But at some point, you could say around the Great Recession and certainly after, there was a bit of a flip, right? Where people are increasingly more likely to find their internships through personal networks, which includes personal research and through friends and family. And so I wanted to start with that to kind of throw it out there that we have seen some, not just growth in the intern economy per se, but some shifts in terms of how people navigate this particular type of economy. And I think that maybe this graph would suggest, this figure would suggest that schools are not investing a lot in internships and the staff, around career development and those types of resources. But I don't think that that's true. Perhaps schools could invest more in internship coordinators and staff or faculty who help students navigate the intern economy. But I think that what this suggests is that the intern economy has grown so quickly and has become essentially, I don't want to say prerequisite, but since 2/3 of arts graduates have done an internship, or at least recent arts graduates have done an internship, it seems like demand on the part of internships, on the part of students, has really outgrown the ability for schools to try to help pair people, right, individuals with intern hosts. So I think that's really what we're seeing with this figure. Sorry, Matt, were you going to say something?
Well, yeah, I was just going to reiterate, this is a goldmine of data. This is great, Alex. And I really appreciate you sharing it with us and with the broader community. A couple of things here. I wonder too if the rise of social media and things like LinkedIn, and then the introduction of, digital career service apps like Handshake and so forth, if that's part of this too, where students are tapping into those online networks a little bit more than talking to a career advisor or a faculty member. But this is a fascinating and a little bit of a troubling chart.
Well, I want you to explain why you think it's troubling. I think I know, but I want you to say it out loud. But first, let me just say that you're absolutely correct, that I think in many ways, this does parallel the rise of the internet. And this is part of the explanation. However, services like Handshake or websites like LinkedIn are not that prevalently used amongst folks in the arts. When I was at another institution, I remember I was a part of a committee related to career development, and I was struck that even though at this one institution, about 6% of students, arts and design students made up about 6% of the university's students, they only accounted for less than 0.5% of all the Handshake participation, the listings and applications. So it seems like this is a kind of labor market that often, except for maybe some of the larger firms, operates sort of at the borders. It is not as formalized a process of working your way into large organizations as it would be perhaps in engineering or a lot of other fields.
Okay, that's really interesting. And I invite any of our participants, if you have any questions about this slide, or if you agree or disagree with my feeling that this is a little troubling, please chime in. But the reason I mention that is we did a small study of business school students at Madison a few years ago, and I was struck by the number, we were doing focus groups. I was struck by the number of young white male, like sophomores, some freshmen, talking about how they had grown up on the golf course with their fathers. And they learned how to network at a very early age with some of the most high-powered, high-positioned executives around Milwaukee. And that was in stark contrast to students in these focus groups who did not have that kind of privilege or access or socialization, who basically say, yeah, they came to Madison and the business school with no networks, no contacts. They had to start it from scratch. And so if that's what's being relied upon, it's gonna favor some of the students who have built-in social capital, social networks from their families and from their privilege. But there's another angle on this that I find a little troubling. My colleague, Matt Wolfgram, who is on this call, we're digging into some of our data from historically Black colleges and universities, where we asked faculty about this, how do you screen students? How do you share opportunities? And it's not just at the HBCUs, this happens at other campuses, but we're finding in some cases really strong gatekeeping, where the faculty are not sharing opportunities with some students that they consider to be not strong, in part because they don't want to send their less talented, I guess, or less strong students to their employers, because those are important relationships. And so they're selecting like the brightest students and then sharing information with them, whereas with others, they're not. And so, yeah, multiple layers of troubling, but I guess it's also fascinating because this is something that people can and should study for a few years.
That's fascinating. No, it's a great point. And when I said that I'm focusing on changes, emerging changes within the intern economy before delving deeper into inequality, I certainly don't mean to imply that this does not, that this should not raise a significant alarm in terms of those who care about equity and diversity in any field. Clearly those who have those family and personal relationships, or who come from family backgrounds, let's say your parents have college education and they are working in professional fields, you're going to have that kind of cultural capital where you feel comfortable reaching out to strangers. You'll know how to reach out to someone through LinkedIn just from implicitly understanding how you've heard your parents talk about their jobs day to day, right? So there's different kinds of knowledge and therefore forms of inequality that can trickle down, just basically coming down to how do people find internships. And that's a theme that came up a lot, as I mentioned, in terms of the open-ended responses. 40% of alumni indicated that they need more help, or they wish that students had more help in terms of finding quality internships. So certainly this is a cause for alarm. Another, I think, cause for alarm is related to the rise of those who do multiple internships. So, and I know that you or colleagues, people from your center have published on this recently. So essentially, people were asked as part of the module to say if they did 0 internship, 1, 2, 3, or more. And it seemed like the pattern was pretty clear that if you look at those who've done 1 internship, and that's in blue, the top line, there was certainly a spike, but it's been pretty much 1 out of 5 alumni, at least for this small subsection that did the module. But then if you look at those who have done multiple internships, there's really been quite a rise over the last 10 to 15 years. And that, of course, is an issue, because often we have conversations about who can have access to internships, right? And we just talked about how one finds an internship. Well, if it can be challenging to find one internship or a good internship, and it can be challenging to afford to do an internship, think about how much more challenging it is to do multiple internships. And so this is something that I think is worthy also of further study. It's something that I certainly encountered in my time doing qualitative research in the music industry in New York. I found that individuals who tended to work their way into the music industry, and I'm talking about people who work at record labels, so I'm more on the business side, not as performers, they tended to do multiple internships, often at multiple companies, or they would do an internship at one site and just camp out there. They would try to go multiple days a week. They would really invest a lot and stay for multiple semesters. Those were the students who really signaled their strong interest in the field, and they are the ones who tended to get hired. So this, to me, is a strong cause for concern.
Yeah, and if I could jump in, Alex, I was just struck by the format of what we're doing right now. This is, at conferences sometimes I just want to interrupt the speaker and talk about a slide and kind of geek out on data. And so this is great because that's what we're doing. Yeah, one of the things that, struck me about this finding, but also the one that came out of our own center is, a lot of people that study hiring, they're talking about internships becoming one of the things that is on a student CV or resume or their job application that employers are looking for, in addition to a credential. And this phenomenon of multiple internships, it's just striking me as it's not just one internship that employers may be looking for, it may be multiple. So I'm really curious about how employers are thinking about multiple internships. But also, as you mentioned, with your research on the music industry and I highly recommend anybody on this watching this webinar to look into Alex's paper. It was in Work and Occupations, is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a fantastic paper on Alex's research on the music industry and internships. But there's definitely an informal aspect. You mentioned camping out, at a record label. There's an informal aspect, and it could be professional networking or just picking up hints about cultural capital. But students are learning a lot, and maybe the employers are doing some subtle screening as well with multiple internships. And so there's a lot to unpack here, but I don't want to keep on going on because I know you have more data to share with us. But this is great, Alex. Thank you.
Well, thank you. But I would like to say a couple things. So the article, which is called Making the Intern Economy, really looks at the different ways that interns understand the intern economy and employers understand the intern economy, and how those may not match up, and usually they don't. And that causes various types of issues, especially really for the intern. The ambiguity of the intern economy falls on the intern to resolve. So, that's something I wanted to clarify. Another thing is really the genesis of this project for me, going all the way back to the dissertation work and this qualitative research, was the fact that in the early 2000s, I moved to New York City before attending grad school. And I was then co-running a record label that I had founded. And I knew a lot of people in the record industry in New York. And so I had proven skills, right? Because I'd done a lot of the work that one does at a record label. I had contacts, so I had the networks already. I already knew these people. But when I moved to New York and I said, I want a job, is anyone hiring? What they told me was, and I really remember one person specifically saying, no one's gonna hire you yet because we know you, but we don't really know you as a worker. So we want you to intern for free. And at some point, I'm sure something will pop up because obviously you're great, but we still need this. Essentially, it was a requirement, is what he was telling me. And there are examples of people getting hired who did not intern, but essentially these are exceptions. And I want to note that because from an early point, I've been thinking about the intern economy and transitioning from a college degree to a career as not just having skills, which I think internships definitely help people develop, as well as the classroom as well, and contacts, which I think a lot of people in higher ed are very focused on, helping students develop their social networks and having people that can vouch for you. But I think that there's something else, and you mentioned, I think the cultural capital, the kind of soft skills, and proving that you can fit in within an environment. I think these are things that I think a lot of employers want. They want to limit risk. They want to limit the burden of training, and they want to limit any kind of uncertainty, even if it's for a relatively low-paid entry-level gig.
Yeah, and at one of our conference sessions, I had an employer that was part of a panel say they view, and this is a very, very large employer outside of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, say that they view internships as a 3-month job interview. And so just this is maybe another wrinkle of troublingness that we're unpacking or uncovering, but it's also fascinating because, yeah, there's less risk once you get to know somebody. It's just a question of who gets in the door to even have that opportunity to show yourself to an employer.
Right. So questions of access, and then questions of how do you communicate that you're a potential employee, because this brings me to my next slide. What a wonderful transition. Why do people do internships? There's so many reasons why people do internships. We would traditionally think of internships as an educational experience. I think we can still claim that the internships are meant to be educational experiences, though people in the workplace do not always necessarily see interns as students. They don't necessarily invest in training interns as one would think of a teacher working with students. But the reason why I wanted to show this slide was that the SNAP module on internships asked essentially, what is the main reason you completed an internship? And as I mentioned, I think we would usually think of internships as educational experiences, which allow students to connect classroom learning to the real world, quote unquote, real world of work. And so my expectation certainly was that the top answers would be expand on what I learned in the classroom. So I thought that would be the most common answer, paired with maybe fulfill a graduate requirement. So maybe these two answers make up 37% of what these arts graduates responded. If you look at the total on the right, and of course there are some historical changes, which I'll get to in a second. So most alumni, I was a little bit surprised, only a little bit surprised, answered more in the career-oriented outcomes, one of those options for their internship experience. They answered building up your resume, which is accounts for a quarter of all answers, testing out a potential career, which is 16%, developing a professional network, which is 10%, and potentially getting hired by the intern host. So the most striking finding, I think, is the way that alumni from various graduation years describe the internship experiences differently. Recent graduates, that would be the 2008 to 2017 column, they were significantly more likely to select career-oriented reasons for interning, like building up your resume, developing a professional network, than earlier graduates who were, in contrast, significantly more likely to select educational reasons for interning, like fulfilling a graduation requirement, et cetera. So these trends don't mean, going back to what I was saying earlier, it doesn't mean that arts programs or higher ed are eliminating internship requirements and not investing in internships. I think this is evidence, further evidence, that the rise of internships is really kind of pushing us to think about how arts graduates are increasingly trying to intern, even if it's not required by their program. So the demand on the part of interns, or on the part of students and interns, the demand is larger than what higher ed is even requiring, even though that has gone up too over time. And so students, I think, and certainly what alumni told us through this survey, are seeing internships more and more as something that's linked to career, as opposed to something that's linked to their education per se.
Yeah, as a learning scientist, this is disappointing, but not surprising. And you know, one of the things that we're delving into in our own center is, you know, how do you design an internship that really is a robust and high quality experiential learning opportunity, right? Which is difficult. It's really hard to do. But you know, as we're going through this analysis, I am reminded, you know, from data like this, but also just talking to students, that for some of them, the learning is secondary to the more utilitarian goal of getting this on my CV. Or just, you know, sometimes students will talk about get an internship. You know, it's like you're taking something off the shelves at a supermarket, you just got it. And then the learning is secondary or just not thought about in too much depth. And sometimes I wonder, like, should colleges and universities be focusing more on volume, on getting a larger number of, you know, maybe so-so internships to more students so that they can just get one? Or should they be investing in, you know, improving the quality of the learning, which when I talk to people in disciplines like social work, Alex, they work at pretty small scale because they're required by accreditation to, you know, create a very rigorous and robust learning internship. And so we're talking like one faculty member overseeing 10 students, you know, and so the scale is pretty small because they need to maintain quality. But if we want to have, you know, internships at scale for an entire college, I'm not sure it's feasible to really put that kind of attention into the learning that happens. So yeah, just some thoughts from this slide, which is great.
Thank you. Well, and thank you. And you're right. It's not feasible, but I think that there need to be efforts towards that goal, right? So, and I think it is happening, and I don't want to sell people short either. I think it is. We are people in higher ed, so I say we are trying to make sure that internships are as intentional as possible. Though I'm not sure the resources are necessarily there sufficiently there to make that happen. I know that we only have about 20 minutes left, so I only have 2 slides left. So if we can flip from why intern to why not intern. So I was really curious. I mentioned that the survey was fielded to about 10,000 alumni, and I should clarify that most, because again, this cross-sectional, people who graduated in the 70s and 80s who were probably not interns received it, right? So most people did not intern. And so I was really curious to hear from them, and also very curious to hear it from the more recent graduates who did not intern. Why did you not intern? And so as internships became more prominent in the last 2 decades, I think it's not surprising that more recent graduates are less likely to select that they did not intern because internships were not offered or they were unaware of opportunities. More recent alumni are aware of opportunities. They know that internships are offered. There are other reasons why they're not interning. More recent cohorts became increasingly likely, if you compare them to previous ones, to answer that they did not intern because they could not afford to do an internship. So 1 in 6, so 16% of individuals who graduated between 2008 and 2017 chose that option. That to me, again, is an area for, I think we can talk about that for the rest of 20 minutes, but it's a big area of concern. And interestingly, I just kind of want to throw this out. Perhaps you're noticing different things here, Matt, but the no time because of required courses reason has also increased over time. No time responses weren't really patterned by parents' education, but in terms of the first gen versus parents have a college education, I should note that first gen college graduates were 56% more likely to select that they could not afford an internship. So these findings, of course, are troublesome, and they suggest an increasing awareness of and prevalence of internships over time, but also the financial and time management challenges involved in balancing coursework and other responsibilities during college.
Right, and one of the great things about doing talks like this, Alex, is just the craft of survey design, because we're in the business of doing that, and so I'm looking at your questions and thinking about how we could add some sub-questions to our own survey about this issue, but also this issue of time, because something that we hear is that the scheduling conflicts come up with both required coursework, but also part-time jobs. And so it just becomes a scheduling issue. And we have a comment from Kate. Thank you, Kate. Many of my students in the performing arts say they'd rather do gig work because it pays a lot better than an internship.
That's a great point. I should add, I'm not sure, Jill, I think Jill Gualtieri is on this Zoom call as well. So she and I are conducting interviews with higher ed folks to better understand and update how higher ed is responding, especially for arts and culture. How are they responding to changing these changes, historical changes and emerging inequalities in the arts? And one thing that I believe Jill heard in a recent interview was that, especially due to COVID, right, when this last summer, many internships were canceled, many students pivoted and instead of doing an internship, because they couldn't, they focused on, often in a very entrepreneurial way, developing experiences for their portfolio. Experiences such as, if you were going to intern as a sound engineer at a studio and that got canceled, well, perhaps you volunteer, you reach out to your local religious institution and say, let me record something for you, perhaps some kind of ceremony or whatnot, and help you put that online. And therefore, the line on your CV that would have been your internship now is something else. And so Kate makes an excellent point. Essentially, what these students are trying to do is build up their portfolio of experiences to demonstrate to future employers and peers that they are worthy of hiring or working with in some way. And there are many ways of doing that. So if one has a kind of careerist approach to doing internships as opposed to just purely developing skills, building up your portfolio kind of is maybe just as good an answer. And you do learn things, of course, from working. So, but you don't have that kind of connection to the classroom and maybe the sort of unpacking of what you're experiencing with a faculty member or some type of internship coordinator. So maybe the educational component could be further developed. But Kate makes an excellent point.
Well, and this raises interesting questions too about online internships in the arts. There's a couple of things that we've found in the last year in our research on online internships. One is when we did a literature review, I expected there to be not much from the arts about remote work or remote internships because it's difficult. But I found some of the best research in music education, where people have figured out how to do remote music, and this was mostly in piano, doing remote lessons for kids. And so students were brought on to watch a master teacher, do remote lessons. And so it's possible to do it. And a lot of people are advocating for remote internships as something to deal with the access issue. If a student's working a part-time job, maybe they can do a remote internship during their off hours. And if they're in a rural setting where they can't find one, maybe this is a way around that. But there's a flip side to that too, because we're also studying what some people call micro internships, which is kind of gig labor. It's project work where a student works 4 to 40 hours on a project. And it's a hit or miss in terms of quality of the experience a student has. And there's some concerns that it's normalizing gig labor, with no benefits, just hourly wages for students. But some of the students pursuing it say, what, I get that, but I need the money, and it's good experience.
Right, that's excellent points all around, and relate also to the possible rise, if we see it continuing, of virtual internships. I think what we saw with the example, I think it was NPR, they usually get, I forget the exact numbers, but say 1,000 applicants for an internship, for a few internships, and this time, because it was virtual, they got over 20,000, right? So so that would create other challenges in terms of getting an internship, but I completely agree that there are opportunities here. So the point of time is my last slide. I wanted to note this because I was struck by really the similarities between what I experienced and observed as an unpaid intern in the music industry as part of my qualitative research and these data with SNAP, which is that spending more time at one's internship per week is linked to an increased likelihood of satisfaction with one's internship. So that's the slide you can see, those who who were an intern for only 5 or fewer hours per week, only a bit more than half said they were they rated their internship as good or very good, but it goes way up if you're there 31 or more hours per week. What you don't see on this slide is that spending more time at one's internship increased the odds that the experience led directly to a job. So specifically, only 1 in 5 alumni who interned 10 hours or less per week responded that the experience led directly to a job, compared to nearly half, so 45% of graduates who interned for 26 hours per week or more. So there seems to be a strong relationship between spending more hours at your internship site and getting a job. Which of course again, who can afford to be an intern for that many hours and not work part-time? Those are some of the issues, of course, that this slide brings up.
Right, and with respect to online internships, Alex, it introduces a question of what does this mean? Is time contact hours where you're physically on a laptop talking to a supervisor, or is it the hours you spend working on a project? Yeah, I'm really glad you asked this question. This is great stuff.
Thank you. And I don't have the numbers in front of me, but and I presented this at the symposium a year and a half ago, but there's a data brief I wrote on why paid internships seem to pay off more than unpaid internships. And there seem to be 2 key variables here. One was that paid interns, according to the SNAP survey, were significantly more likely to claim that they were closely mentored. And secondly, they were more likely to claim that they had done work that involved creative input or judgment compared to unpaid interns. So it seems like the quality of experience is different at various levels between paid and unpaid internships.
Wow, that's interesting. Well, we have about 10 minutes left, webinar world. So if anybody that's on right now has any questions for Alex, comments about internship economy, internship in the arts, the weather, anything, please throw it in there in the chat. I'll go ahead and start briefly though. Jillian, I hope I'm pronouncing your name properly, but your comment here about the rise of projects is striking because one of the things that we uncovered in our literature review was the rise in faculty, and I really found this in medical education, using kind of virtual simulations or some sort of online, simulated work experience in the classroom or as part of a course. And part of this was to intentionally, mimic an internship for students who wouldn't be able to take one. I'm wondering if that's something that you've come across or thought about or seen in your research on internships in the arts.
That is a great question. And Jill might be able to answer that question as well. I have not, this idea of simulating experiences, internship experiences is very, very new to me. It's something that Jill and I've encountered very recently through interviewing individuals who work in career development and internship coordinators at institutions of higher ed. So this seems to be the kind of the reaction, the pivot, what to do under conditions of a pandemic. This is very new to me in the arts. Now, with that said, there is a lot of variation in terms of the formality of experiences of interns in the arts. So, if I think about it a little further, I could probably think of ideas of times where there were micro internships or simulated internships. For example, one person I interviewed many years ago said that his boss's daughter was coming to work for a one-day internship. And he was basically complaining to me when I was an intern, and we developed a kind of rapport that he can complain to me. He was saying, what do I do with an intern for one day? I felt like telling him, I don't think that's actually an internship, but this goes to the fact that people use the word internship in a variety of contexts that don't always necessarily match our more scientific understandings or educational understandings of the term.
Right, and I think with some of the simulated experiences, there's a spectrum too of what can be created and then embedded within a course. Because some, cases where I've seen this happen, it is basically like a field trip where the instructor is just trying to show the students, this is what it's like in a recording studio. This is what it's like in a photography studio, and maybe an interview with the business owner, a tour of the facilities and so on. But then on the other end, and you see this in engineering and medical education, educators, but also people now in virtual reality, they're taking criteria from accreditation standards and creating, situations where you're, doing surgery or delivering bad news to a patient or something like that. And the students actually ensconced in this virtual environment where they have to act out. It's like a role play. And again, part of this they're doing, because internships may not be accessible, but it's also just a pedagogical move to say, let's use technology and embed it within a course and start, shifting the lecture kind of venue into a more experiential mode of learning.
That's fascinating. And it relates a little bit to another trend that I perceived, and I'm curious if you've perceived this as well. There seems to be a movement, and certainly over the last decade or two, that career centers no longer want to be thought of as a physical place, right? So well before the pandemic, career development and career centers on campus at various universities want to be seen as something that can be embedded into various parts of the curriculum. And when you're describing these types of experiences, to me, although you're describing them as educational experiences, and I agree they are, they're opportunities, but also certainly challenges to thinking in these ways of how can we build in this kind of experiential learning into the classroom, into these types of virtual experiences. And I also never thought, honestly, there are these types of trips where you go somewhere for a week and go to New York City and meet a bunch of people in industry for a week. Usually those experiences involve having that kind of contact with gatekeepers, but they don't necessarily involve kind of problem solving. But I love the idea of maybe pairing that with actual activities that maybe you would get feedback from people in industry for later on. Perhaps this exists, but I don't think I've encountered that yet.
Yeah, and one of the things that I found too in speaking with faculty at community colleges is, and in part it's due to the mission of their institutions, they're very good at combining, these ideas of a remote or virtual or simulated learning experience with career opportunities or career development. The cases that I mentioned in medical education and engineering, as far as I recall, the idea of making that a career-related activity is not present. It's more about learning the material. So I think, as we go in this direction, learning more from our colleagues in community colleges will be really important. I'm not sure how much this applies to the arts, but they're actively and daily thinking about their students' career futures, as well as educational mission.
Right, and I know that it's done also where you'll have a guest speaker either in person or they'll Zoom in, and this is pre-pandemic as well, where people will talk about the work that they do. And so I'm using the example of the music industry. People will talk about challenges of how do I do A&R or promotions or publicity, and then the students will reflect back. And so these types of strategies I think are common in the arts, but I think elevating it to the level you're talking about, I'm less familiar with in terms of these types of simulated experiences.
Right, and I think we may let Jillian have the last word here. She made an observation about internship courses that provide students guidance while doing the internships, especially around soft skills and cultural capital. And this is something in our research that we're paying a lot more attention to, is when there's a required course credit-bearing component that's part of the internship experience, which is increasingly common. And again, I'm not sure about in the arts, but it does add another element to the student's experience. I think, again, there's a spectrum of situations where in some cases we've seen the students meet, maybe two or, one time a month as a cohort, and they talk about all this stuff. Where on the other end of the spectrum, some students that I found that are taking courses, they talk to their advisor once in a semester and it's an email. And so, again, there's a spectrum, but this is an opportunity to kind of add some depth and texture to the whole experience.
I agree. And I would just add to that, that actually SNAP data shows that 3/4 of alumni who filled out the module indicate that they did receive school credit. So 3/4 received school credit for their internship, but that number has actually gone down a bit. It was 80% for those who graduated in 2007 and earlier, before the 2013, 2017 cohort, especially the more recent graduates, it's more like 2/3, which I think, again, to me points to not the fact that internships are less common, it's because they're more common. They're so common that perhaps there have been more zero credit options that have been developed on the part of higher ed. And essentially people are more likely to intern outside the confines of the institution. So, and they're big, and this is also an area about the connection between classroom and internship. This is also another place where we see a lot of inequality. In my internship, undergraduate internship study of music industry future potential employees, I found that people who graduate from more elite institutions tended to have these types of courses where they actually talk through at least a few times in the semester, but maybe every single week, talk through problems and get this kind of critical kind of cultural capital and soft skill development. These students may not have liked going to those courses, but they certainly later on talked about how they learned and it helped them navigate the intern economy. Whereas individuals who graduated from less prestigious or less well-funded universities, places like CUNY, they often did have a course, but the professor in one instance said he just canceled it because he wanted to make sure the students could spend more time at the internship. So there was less sort of development of soft skills and cultural capital in those types of environments. So that really just exacerbates inequalities that exist even before the start of the college experience.
That's a great point, Alex. And I think we'll end with that. Thank you so much for this hour you've spent with me and with our audience. And again, this will be posted on our CCWT website for posterity to observe and learn from. And did you have any parting thoughts, words of wisdom, anything, Alex, from Tennessee?
Thank you. Well, my only parting thought is that this is ongoing research. If anybody would like to speak with Jill and myself, we are conducting interviews, especially with higher ed personnel of all levels and types, and all types of institutions, not necessarily just arts related. So please reach out.
Great. And thank you for joining us, and everybody stay safe out there and stay warm, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.